Tom Woods Show, episode 2158.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, if you're like me, when you criticize the Federal Reserve, you get all these lackey-style responses. Why, the Fed has made the economy more stable. You don't want to go back to the 19th century, do you? All kinds of arguments like that. Well, you can blow those and others out of the water with my free ebook, Our Enemy, the Fed. Grab it at ourenemythefed.com. Hey, everybody, Tom Woods here. Our old friend from the Libertarian Institute, Keith Knight, is back with us again. And man, does he have a great project that I endorse wholeheartedly. I hope everybody gets a copy. It's really, really excellent and important and necessary. It's the Voluntarist Handbook, and it's a series of about 50 selections from some of the best people in our movement, the smartest, most persuasive, and of those people's work, he's picked out really the most provocative, the most relevant, the most convincing stuff they've done. Because frankly, we're arguing for points most people have never even thought of before. It's not they've thought of them and they've rejected them. It's never even occurred to them that these were options. So we've got to be on top of our game if we're going to have any hope of success. And this book will help you do that, and you will enjoy reading it. You will really enjoy reading it because your mind is just blown. No matter how well you know this material, your mind is just blown chapter after chapter by this. So it's a really, really great piece of work. Keith, welcome back.
Tom Woods, thank you so much for having me.
All right, this is going to be great. You know, I see a lot of myself in you in that all of a sudden you just burst onto the scene some time ago, and you're full of this youthful energy and enthusiasm that comes from encountering this whole tradition of thought and being spellbound by it and thinking, I cannot immerse myself in this stuff enough, and I want to make a contribution to it too, and I want to do what I can to spread the word about it. I think that sounds like a fair summary of Keith Knight, does it not?
Yeah, it definitely does. Because originally, the corporate press was just issuing what seemed like universal opinions. We have to hate this thing, COVID, or Putin, or Iran, or the Taliban, or the Republicans. It seemed like there was never a real sound reason to support or oppose something. So then when I come across something like the works of Rothbard or Hoppe, I say, well, heavens, this is looking at the world through a totally different lens. So I wanted to have a book that I could just send to people, give them a free PDF if they want. This way they could be introduced to these ideas and not have to tune into 42 minutes of Brian Stelter every night to see what's going on in the world.
Well, honestly, if somebody reads this, that person will have seared into his brain a way of looking at the world, a filter through which to understand events that will serve him well throughout life. And I think these selections are very well chosen. In fact, I really think that this has become one of the go-to books that you want to refer people to in this area of, let's say, voluntarism or anarcho-capitalism or whatever. I actually think I would refer people to this when they are, let's say, curious about what we think, or they've absorbed a lot of minarchism, and you say to them, okay, but I think you may still have some assumptions that need to be examined. This is the next one because it's just unrelenting. It is merciless. It is one chapter after another of some of the best minds we have, living and dead. I love your selections. Some of them are selections I'd forgotten about, but then I looked at the table of contents and I thought, oh, yeah, I remember this one's good. You absolutely have to have this. So let's talk about that, by the way, here. I noticed, by the way, I may just point out, there's a selection from Woods here in the book. That was kind of nice to see. A little tear came to my eye here. Are there people, let's see. Let's try to think about this, because when people think about libertarianism in the general public, they think of Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and John Stossel. And maybe if they are really advanced students, they think of F.A. Hayek. Yeah. And yet, I don't think, as I'm looking over here, I don't think any of those people figure into this book. Now, that could be because they're not pure so-called voluntarists. That's true. So why don't we start there, first of all? Let's start, first of all, with what that term means, and then I want to get into the selection of these particular people as representatives.
So as far as people like Hayek go, Chapter 50 is just a collection of all my favorite quotes on these topics, and Hayek is in there, Mises is in there, a lot of our other heroes who I didn't have room for a full chapter. They have tons of quotes in those sections.
Right. Yes.
So the term voluntarism, I'm using Auburn Herbert, the founder of voluntarism, his definition, the moral position which maintains that no peaceful person can justly be submitted to the control of others in the absence of his or her own consent. That is what I mean when I refer to voluntarism. I have a list of all the terms on pages, I think it's 2 and 3. This way, people are at least on the same page with me. So when I say capitalism, people don't necessarily assume big business getting the troubled asset relief package. They can tell by these definitions that has nothing to do with the institutionalized recognition of private property and non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners.
I've had Sheldon Richman on the show to talk about a variety of topics, but one time I had him on to talk about one of his books, and we were really talking about some of the foundational principles of libertarianism. You have him in here more than once. One of them is in chapter 9 called Social Cooperation. And as I look at that, it reminds me that some of what, let's say, people who dislike us have managed to do is to demonize us by using boogeyman terms about what we believe. So it's trickle-down economics, or phrases like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or the survival of the fittest, or something like that. So when somebody like Sheldon Richman comes along and looks at the free market and uses this quite benign-sounding term, social cooperation, to refer to it, well, that's quite jarring. And it sure would be nice if people would do us the courtesy of using the kinds of terms we ourselves use to describe our ideas. It'd be nice if people learned that libertarians are fundamentally about social cooperation. However, that is not, as you well know, that is not what people learn. How is it possible for Sheldon Richman to use a term like that would be rejected by pretty much all our opinion leaders as a descriptor for libertarianism?
Mainly, we can maybe blame ourselves for this. We haven't done a good job communicating the message. That is my favorable interpretation of it. But Sheldon, let me give you the example that I think Sheldon would agree with. People might see things as doing some things together, for example, playing football, and doing things by yourself, playing solitaire. What Sheldon Richman realizes is that even the guy who plays solitaire by himself did not invent the game. He didn't invent the cards. He didn't invent the numbers on the cards. He's probably playing on a computer that he didn't invent with electricity. He's not currently generating in a house he didn't build. We're constantly the result of things that have happened previously that we have cooperated to achieve such an end. So it's not that there's things you do by yourself and things you do with others. It's a much more accurate way to say everything is done, even talking. We didn't invent these words. Even talking, we are constantly cooperating with other people, and what we are is the result of a lot of other actions. So once you put it in this frame, you can then say, okay, now we have two realms of distinguishing justified social interaction between unjustified, meaning things we can do cooperatively, voluntarily, where people can have their own standards. That's the greatest check and balance that a society can have, the freedom to disassociate with bad actors. We can have that, or we could have some people having the right to coerce others at their expense. So I would say that people have kind of gotten into the idea that government is the one thing that we as a society all do together. However, the supermarket also falls under that umbrella. So the average person has erroneously believed that government is the unique cooperator in society when, as Rothbard and many others point out, that's not a distinguishing characteristic. That's not a unique feature that defines it. Actually, it's the absence of cooperation and mutually beneficial voluntary exchange. It claims the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. So because the average person has seen government as the single unifier, the single method of cooperation in society, they've assumed that anyone who doesn't support that must support Robinson Crusoe, everyone doing things only by himself.
It's worth noting that Mises' great treatise, Human Action, was originally going to be titled Social Cooperation, and then it was changed. And I feel like that was a missed opportunity. I think it would have been much, much better to name the book Social Cooperation. Human action, you don't even know what that means, frankly. Average person doesn't even understand what that title means. But social cooperation, and then you find out that the book is about the free market economy. That gets people thinking.
Sure.
Yeah. So anyway, I wish they had gone with that. I see so many of my favorite writers, and in fact, Tom Woods Show guests in this table of contents. One of them is Michael Huemer. And Michael Huemer is really, really good at coming up with original arguments for our positions and for coming up with really apt analogies. Because sometimes people can't really see problems with the state until they imagine, well, let's draw an analogy. Let's imagine this kind of behavior occurring in social life or, in your day-to-day activity outside the state. You'd never tolerate A, B, C, or D, and yet we think nothing of it when the state does it. He's really, really good at those. And you have a selection from him here. Now, it's really almost unfair of me because you have this book, it's over 300 pages, and you have, 50 different chapters. So if I just pick one out, I feel like, what if he forgets what this one was about? But can you introduce us to some degree, at least, to Michael Huemer? And by the way, I point this out. I asked this question in full realization that one of the times I was a guest with you as the host, you ran through a series of important thinkers in libertarianism or voluntarism, and it was like a lightning round. You said the name, and then I talked about some of their key ideas, and I think you gave me Michael Huemer, so I'm going to toss him back at you. What can you tell us about him?
So Huemer has the excellent method of taking someone's premise and showing this premise I totally agree with. However, I disagree with the conclusion that this premise gives. So already you're taking people off the defensive. So that's why I was so appreciative of some of his early work. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to things like, well, the state does things daily that we would commend as terrible if anyone else did them. For example, how I can't imagine a 24-hour period that's gone by where someone hasn't thrown at me bad working conditions in the Industrial Revolution, as if ushering in a state automatically improves working conditions for the globe. But we would never say, hey, the Russian government is murdering people in Ukraine and Ukraine's murdering people in the Donbass. You statists need to answer for this. Look at all this government tragedy that's happening. How about that First World War? What a tragedy. Why would you guys advocate that system? So just getting in that rhythm that humor gets you to thinking, you become sort of guilt-free when you advocate things like this. But the specific section that I chose for humor, his most popular book is The Problem of Political Authority. I have a number of quotes in the back, but he has another book titled Knowledge, Reality, and Value, where he lists his 14 most important logical fallacies. And one of them that he lists is credulity. And it's great because he shows you how to sort of walk through media manipulation that you otherwise wouldn't recognize. So I'd say the most important thing that he has brought to the table are these logical fallacies. In the credulity section, he says, basically, the news is nonsense. And by this, I mean almost everything falls into the category of ideological bias, meaning things are cherry-picked. By the very nature of you picking to report on one thing and not another, that is a bias. How much time you spend on it, that is also a bias. I had an intelligence officer come on my show, a guy named Chase Hughes, and he said, if I could summarize mind control in one word, it would be repetition. So this is how the media is really able to plant ideas in the minds of the populace. Imagine if there were pictures of civilians all over the news every time a government drone killed civilians, like they are with who are referred to as shooters, but they're actually murderers. The second thing he says to look out for is sensationalism. With the January 6th thing, you would have thought that 30,000 people died on this day. It lasted for months on end. The sensationalist tactics that the media use to tell you one thing is vitally important and it's a total danger to civilization, that is one of the greatest propaganda tricks around. And then he says the third thing you have to look out for is laziness. There was a great article on CNBC, great in the sense of it really exposes the people. This was in, I think, 2020. It said, why economists don't think trillions of dollars inputted into the economy will lead to price inflation. It's something to that extent. It's just so in your face. Now, one interpretation could be this reporter's a liar, working for the state, working for the Fed. That could be true. The problem is a lot of people actually believe this who are not necessarily agents or provocateurs. So simply the idea of being lazy, where people have not taken the time to look into topics, makes them inherently biased. It takes a long time to understand history, economics, philosophy, why wars happen, why peace happens, why some countries are wealthy, why others are poor. Very few journalists have done that work. So humor, exposing media bias through sensationalism, cherry picking, and laziness, I think is his best contribution.
By the way, for anybody listening who's curious about him, his last name is spelled Huemer. So it's not what you're thinking. Now, also, another helpful thing to do, and I was just making a presentation about this the other night, about how to give an effective speech, how to make an effective presentation. And the key question you have to ask yourself always is, who is my audience in this case? I always want to know who is sitting out there in the audience. Mm-hmm. And not because you're going to pander to them, but because, for example, you'll know roughly what their knowledge level is. You won't bore them by being too simple, or you'll know that it's a mixed crowd. So you can't take things for granted that everybody's going to know who Lysander Spooner is, for instance, or everybody's necessarily going to agree with Lysander Spooner. And that way you can make an appeal in your remarks that will resonate with as many people as possible. Well, I say this by way of introduction to the piece you have in here by Lew Rockwell, which is a right-wing case against the police state, because here you might not think you're interested in reading an article like that. But the point is, there are a lot of people who do need to read that because they think that if you have objections to the police, that makes you some pinko commie. And so therefore they have to be in support of the police. But that's not necessarily exhaustive, of all the possibilities. So how is, now again, I'm asking a lot of you here to have memorized your entire book consisting of selections by other people. But how does Lew frame that?
Just as you would, or as almost anyone would oppose a monopoly on books or computers, they might say, well, this would lead to a disincentive for them to keep improving, because if you have a monopoly on books or computers, you basically have the market cornered, and you can have high prices, people can't go anywhere. You could have low quality and people can't go anywhere. What Lew Rockwell does is he takes the wisdom of Gustave de Molinari and says, for the same reason we should oppose monopolies in these other areas, the desire to have security in your persons and property, there's nothing about this that is so unique that it violates these economic laws of needing competition, of needing the freedom to disassociate with bad actors, with people who provide poor quality. So the same thing would apply. Now, getting into why someone who is specifically conservative might find this troubling. The average conservative could be summarized that they see a lot of things through the lens of civilization versus barbarism. Well, certainly if we're talking about great mass murder, great mass property damage, the state is absolutely king of these tragedies. When it comes to indiscriminate bombings, when it comes to theft of people's wages and their ability to raise a family, devaluing the currency, creating the boom and bust cycle with interest rate manipulation through the Federal Reserve, so much chaos and barbarism, you could call it, not to mention the universities, which advocate things like leftism, just totally in abolition of private property and voluntary norms. The police officer, what they do in this situation is they've taken an oath to enforce these state edicts. So you can actually see them as one of the root causes of the most amount of barbarism that exists. And having a heavily funded police means at any time it can be turned on you, and you would not have the right to disassociate with them because they are, in effect, a monopoly, a coercively funded one, which has the right to do things that no one else has the right to do. So I think the conservative confuses the desire for security and stability with the assumption that this group, police, is the sole provider of this thing. When you look at things like PayPal, eBay, Amazon, all of these places have the incentive to provide you with security in your transactions. Alarm systems and private gun ownership do a great job of deterring crime. So it does not necessarily follow that if I desire security, I desire a state. In fact, you might actually say the opposite. Security is so vitally important, we can't leave it up to a coercively funded monopoly. It has to be brought into the area of voluntarily funded competition.
How did you choose these selections? First of all, you have to be extremely well-read to be aware of them all, for one thing. Some of them are really classic pieces. Sometimes you had to go to the trouble of excerpting from a much longer selection. But what was your criterion?
Originally, I was a progressive, and then I became a conservative, and then a voluntarist. So I looked through all the things that I had read and saved, and I said, okay, which ones of these were like the real, I guess you could call them red pill moments, or times that something really stood out to me as, wow, this really changes the way I see the world, or I can analyze problems. And so I really went through all the research that I had previously done and said, it was this book, or it was this chapter, or it was this quote in this book. So having underlined a lot of things in previous books that I've read certainly helped. But the main criteria was, did this help sway me from progressivism or conservatism to libertarianism?
All right. Well, I actually think every one of these really does pack that kind of punch. So they are very, very well chosen indeed. If you had to pick, you can't pick one, right? This is like asking you to pick your favorite child or something. So maybe there's a handful. Are there a few that have a special place in your heart you think are particularly provocative, interesting, surprising, challenging that you can talk to us about?
I would say Stefan Molyneux's chapter 7. It's titled 6 Questions for Status. This is an excerpt from his book. I believe it's Practical Anarchy, the Freedom of the Future. And he says, look, before getting into the deep weeds of this philosophy, I just want to have 6 questions on the table that we should have when discussing the concept of anarchism versus the idea of statism. So he says, let me just quote this verbatim. So he says, question 1, does government actually solve the problem in question? So when it comes to someone saying, well, we need courts, well, we need police, schooling might be the best example, because you can say, yes, we do need schooling. Does 12 years of government education make the entire population educated? According to you people, the population is so dumb that they elect this idiot Trump, or the other half elect a dementia patient. I mean, this is 12 years and hundreds of billions of dollars being generated, and you don't have much to show for it. So again, the idea that, well, we need something does not necessarily follow that it should be provided by a coercively funded monopoly. He goes, second question, can the criticism of the anarchic solution be equally applied to the statist solution? So we get this very often. If there were private security firms, one might not like the other, tensions might rise, and they might start using weapons that they have against each other and committing murder. Well, one could ask, is there a history of governments ever going to war against each other? I mean, it's so ridiculous. But at the same time, this is a question that a lot of people actually bring up. And Molyneux later in this book says, now the cost of violence is extremely high. So if you have a group which receives its funding coercively, that's going to incentivize more war than would otherwise exist if people had to bear the cost of their actions. So again, this is very common. People will accuse the voluntary sector of something that applies to the state. I think profit might actually be the best example, where people say, the thing about the free market is it's profit seeking. Okay, as if Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are a couple of volunteers who have never made any money, as if teachers don't get paid. Well, if it costs you 50 cents to drive to work and you make $200 that day, you've profited greatly. So again, they keep having these criticisms that also apply, or apply many times over, to the state. He then says, is anarchy accepted as a core value in non-political spheres? So it's just fun asking people on social media whether or not they have a license to issue their opinions, and couldn't this be a threat to democracy and civilization if we have unregulated conversations in so many areas of people's life? They demand that they're able to do something without a third party coercing them. Thomas Sowell makes the great point that the people who are very passionate about legalizing consensual intercourse among consenting adults have no desire at all for those same two adults to base their actions on consent in the economic sphere. So is there any other time? Is it always okay for a third party to coercively impose themselves? And why in some cases and not others? He said, would the person advocating statism perform state functions himself? Said, would you be willing to use actual force to force someone to fund an educational program? Well, then anyone who's an author can basically force fund their operation so long as they provide a book which educates people. So if the justification for the state schooling system is that, well, it's necessary. Well, food is necessary. Can anyone coerce someone else so long as they later get food from it? Molyneux goes on, can something be both voluntary and coercive at the same time? This is the concept of the consent of the governed, which legitimizes democracy while vilifying monarchy. Yet if it's consensual, why are there laws threatening to put people in jail if they disobey? So he says there's no logic behind this. And then finally he says, does political organization change human nature? So if your idea is that human beings are so bad there can't be a state, what species of people do you want to occupy this government? Does someone getting elected to office make them stop being greedy? To the contrary, if people are greedy, you want to channel that greed into the voluntary sector where they can't take a penny out of your pocket unless someone voluntarily gives it to them, or they can't get a second of your time unless they choose to allocate the scarce resource of their time to you. So I would say that was my favorite just because it was such a heavy hitter for me.
I, of course, now have to ask the question, what made you stop being a progressive?
It was getting introduced to Glenn Beck because I had heard that basically, look, we want to give people stuff. We want to give them healthcare. We want education. We want these opportunities. Yet there are actually people that are against this. And I don't know what it could be. So it has to be because, the America racist history has to be because the current president at the time, Barack Obama, is Black. So I went to Glenn Beck's show to hate watch him. And he mentioned that there is a part of the Affordable Care Act, which of course has increased healthcare prices, that does not allow people, I think it's called the individual mandate. And he said, this forces people to buy something against their will, whether or not they want it, if they want to take the risk, if they want to gamble, if they want to skydive, very risky things. If you want to join the military, isn't that risky? Well, if people want to take their own risks, they should have the right to do so. And so first, this was just such a life-changing moment for me because I had just assumed there can't be any good arguments. And not only was this a good argument, it was so foundational. And I go, how is it that I've been interested in these issues for a few years and I've never heard something this basic? And I eventually just took that principle and expanded it to state schooling, to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that if you can't get anyone's justly acquired property through the voluntary sector, you have to improve quality. You have to lower the price. You have to create some value or ask to get it on a voluntary basis. So that was basically, you can still have the desire for equality if you're a libertarian. You just have to recognize the state is the most unequal thing in society. It's the mechanism by which some people have the explicit right to do something that no one else has. 535 people control 330 million. And they say that that's why we need equality. So it was flat out contradictions that most likely did it. And then also, that is a self-serving answer. I did so totally logically, but it's very possible that it was just because progressives are so explicitly racist and sexist that I'm just like, gosh, I really don't like hanging out with these people anymore. So when I was introduced to people like Ed Stringham, Jeffrey Tucker, guys in suits and ties who call themselves anarchists, I go, okay, well, I'm at least willing to listen to these people because they're not a bunch of, trash can throwers and people bashing a Starbucks or something. So I think it was the collection between the logical side and the reasoning that they were just so difficult to be around, injecting race or gender, arbitrary, accidents of birth into every single decision that they came across. I'd say those were the main two.
Wow, that is a really interesting story. And then the Glenn Beck thing is interesting because how few people sit and listen to, especially when they're, as you say, you were tuning in specifically to refute him or see what he was up to. And then you listened enough to say, well, maybe he's telling me the truth about this particular thing. Maybe he's right about this. That's so rare. I mean, I know you know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know already, but that is so rare these days. As I look, I think that, by the way, that if people could just see the table of contents of this book, the Voluntarist Handbook, it sells it. It sells it right there. So just without even saying who the contributors are, some people will know some of them, some won't. You mentioned Ed Stringham. So he's got How Private Governance Made the Modern World Possible. Really, how could you not be curious about that? Then you have my piece, The Misplaced Fear of Monopoly. Then Privatize the Roads. Is Equality a Worthy Goal? Roderick Long's piece, The Case for Libertarian Anarchism, Responses to 10 Objections, is an excellent one.
Yeah.
I was actually there when he delivered that as a speech, and I was in the room when he did that. And that's really, really great. Then excerpts from Bob Murphy's Chaos Theory, Can Anarcho-Capitalism Work? By Lou Rockwell. The State is Too Dangerous to Tolerate by Bob Higgs. Welfare Before the Welfare State. The Anti-Capitalist Ideology of Slavery. And so many more pieces in here that you take them together and it's just an irresistible onslaught of arguments in favor of freedom. So you have a minute to make an elevator pitch for the Voluntarist Handbook. Now, I'm going to say, I'll take away one of the points you might make. You can get the book for free as a PDF. So that would be a selling point, but I'm going to take that from you and tell the audience that in a minute we'll tell people how they can actually download it for free. But if you're like me, you want to flip through this thing physically. I want to get a physical copy, which I will do. And by the way, was it published by the Libertarian Institute?
Yes.
Okay, so you're going to be helping a good cause too, the Libertarian Institute. So what would be your, okay, hey, look, I've read a lot of this stuff and I listen to a lot of podcasts. Why do I need this book?
This is a collection of works that tries to approach the same end, achieving your ends in life voluntarily, through 50 different starting points. So you can actually scram through and look at any chapter. Roderick Long's healthcare chapter, for instance, is a great starting point. So if you're someone on the left who feels like a large portion of society is left out of the great deal of the human experience, you can look at people like Roderick Long and Sheldon Richman. If you're a conservative, you can check out the excellent chapter, The Reluctant Anarchist by Joe Sobran, the former senior editor of National Review for 18 years. He worked with William Buckley and then met Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe and said that actually the great deal of our problems are the result of the idea of statism, that people have a different moral double standard. And also people on the right, like Hans Hoppe in his excellent article in this collection, Marxist versus Austrian Class Analysis. He takes the principles of Marxism and says, even if you believe these things, I believe that if you apply them consistently, you can see that the great exploiter in society is not people in the voluntary sector or the rich, whoever they are. It's actually the people who achieve their ends coercively, whether it's someone stealing on a small scale or someone in a Ponzi scheme or the biggest thief of all, the state. So because you're able to have 50 different starting points for how you can come to the same conclusion, I think this book does that effectively, and that's why people should check it out.
Very, very well done. By the way, that Hoppe piece, Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis, when I was first getting to know Michael Rechtenwald, who's an ex-Marxist from NYU, he was mostly over on our side by that point. But, he's still got some Marxist ideas that maybe he was unsure of how do you respond to them. And I actually referred him to this article because I thought it was so well done that if you look at the claims of Marxism in their purest form, according to Hoppe, you can in fact find some truth in them. The problem is they're just misapplied. Yes, there are exploiters. You're just misidentifying who the exploiters are. And he just goes through and makes, I thought, a case that is very helpful for somebody who still has some Marxist baggage to say, wait a minute here. Okay, maybe there is something to this libertarianism or voluntarist argument. So on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2158, I'm going to link you to how you can get this book in a hard copy. So if you're old-fashioned like me, so you can flip through it. But I'll also include a link to how you can get a free PDF download of the book. So if you don't feel like spending one red cent, you do not have to do that. So that'll be, once again, at tomwoods.com/2158. Keith, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for being here. And congratulations on this very worthy project.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody, I am heading out the door because I'm going to be staying, even though I'm only 45 minutes away from this place, I'm going to be staying in Orlando for a couple of nights this weekend because I'm putting on a little conference, and it's a members-only conference. It's for people who joined me back in February in the Tom Woods School of Life, where we've spent the past half year looking at one area after another where we can get better in our lives, better at managing money, better at getting our kids educated in a hostile world, better at figuring out where you can live in this crazy country, where you're least likely to be harassed. We're doing business coaching for people who need that. We're talking about health, how to stay healthy, without listening to what Dr. Fauci has to say. What are the real paths to health? Just the other night, I did a presentation on how to give an effective speech. And I went through clips of some of my own speeches, and I explained in real time with the video playing in the background, here's what I was doing here, and here's what I was doing there. So it's a lot of fun. It's transformational. It's helped a lot of people. And this weekend, we're having a conference, again, on all practical things. No theory, no non-aggression principle, all practical things about how you can prosper in a world that hates you. And it is concluding with comedy from Dave Smith. So it's going to be great. I didn't even tell people we were going to have an in-person event that they could choose to attend. I just threw it in as an unannounced bonus because that is the kind of guy I am. My members don't have to pay 1 cent to attend this event, to see Dave Smith, to hear all these practical talks, to socialize, to have fun, to meet other people who are tired of whining and want to actually pick up some tools and do something. I'll be reopening the School of Life to more members first few days of August, and then the doors will swing shut again. So hop on the waiting list at tomschooloflife.com. See you next week.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.